We were also joined by our next speaker, who threw the weight of the Green Party behind the refugees' welcome movement. So please give a warm welcome to the leader of the Green Party, Natalie Bennett.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much for reminding us of that wonderful day. And wasn't the feeling on the streets of London absolutely brilliant?
Very much.
And I think I'm really encouraged to see, particularly this evening, we had a similar event to this a couple of months ago now, and this hall was about half or so full, and see how full it is tonight. So thank you everyone who's come along on a weekday evening to really carry the flame of the spirit of the streets of London of that day and take it forward. And I think it's really important that we think about that and focus on that rightly, as the organisers have done, by thinking about what's happening in the referendum debate. Because there is a problem, but it's also an opportunity. And the problem is that this is a chance for some really terrible things to be said in the interest of we've got to have a wide open debate about the referendum and say all these kind of things. But it's also an opportunity to say the kind of things that the Green Party is saying, to put it very simply, to say we celebrate the free movement of people in the EU. It enriches all of our lives. And there may be some people in this room who won't agree with me, but stay with me here, because I want to tell you a little bit about we're campaigning for a Remain vote in the referendum. Yes. We believe we should work together jointly on the problems that we face. But we're also, our campaign is called Greens for a Better Europe, because what we want is not just free movement of people in the EU. We want to abolish Fortress Europe, the way in which we've got free movement within, and then barbed wire at the edges, or indeed increasingly in the middle. And it is worth saying, it is worth noting that if you look at the refugees already in Europe, the European Commission did actually propose a very fair and reasonable formula by which those refugees could be shared, welcomed around European countries based on GDP, based on population, land area, unemployment rate. And it was national governments that said no to that. And that gives us a real pointer to what we need to do in terms of both making a better EU and indeed making a better Britain and all sorts of other countries, which is we need to change the politics. It's not so much an necessary question of changing the structures, although, of course, if we're looking at Britain, electoral reform, given we've got a system that gave us a government with the support of 24% of eligible voters, we need to reform in Westminster, we need reform in Brussels. But what we really need to do is elect different people with a different kind of politics. And that's what will give us a fair, just, humane immigration system and fair, just, legal, according to the UN Convention, treatment of refugees. Change the politics, we change everything else. Now, I think some of the arguments we've seen in the referendum that are worth confronting, and I actually encountered the UKIP version of this back in January on 5 Live. I must admit it was a good job I was sitting down, because I might have fallen down, because I encountered a UKIP man who was there as a champion of why he wanted to leave the EU, because then Indian grandmas would be able to come and live with their grandchildren in Britain. Here's UKIP as a champion of Indian grandmothers, which was a new one on me. But what's being said, even by some relatively reasonable people who've been fooled, is by saying, why should people in Europe have free movement when people from other parts of the world aren't able to come to Britain? And I think it's really important that we tackle that head on and say, we don't have any kind of fair, humane immigration policy. That's not the fault of Europe. That's the fault of our government. And if you look at what's happening today, the SNP did a good job of highlighting the kind of case that really, does often make the government roll over. A 7-year-old autistic boy in Scotland whose first language is Gaelic, who the government wants to deport to Australia. And those are the kind of examples that, really people do latch onto. But it's really important to put it in that broader context and say Europe is not the problem here. I shouldn't personalise it, but hell I will. Theresa May is the problem. And I think in some ways what I'm doing here is mixing up, and we have to, while also drawing distinctions, mix up the debate about immigration, the broader debate about immigration, with the debate about refugees, because the other side does very much mix them up. And we do have to put them together and also recognise the line between someone who can prove they're a refugee, particularly under our incredibly unjust, inhumane system in the Home Office that tries to find every reason it possibly can to reject an application and then very likely lock you up in somewhere like Yarlswood, including, as last year, 99 pregnant women. That's the line is thin, so we've got to put all this argument together. But I think I'd like to bring up something Lord Dubs said, which I think is really important. It's good to focus sometimes on the easy cases. And I think saying those children should be able to come to Britain in time to start the school year is a lovely argument. And I think I'm going to back that tonight and say, let's all get out there and say that. And I think reflecting on what our NUT speaker said, and I echo the thanks to the NUT for allowing us to be here tonight, it is really important to get out there and talk to young people and talk about the reality of the lives of children in Calais, children across Europe, children in Greece, children in places like Lebanon and Jordan. And so one of the stories that I tell is the story of Masood, who was a 17-year-old Afghan boy. And I think there's probably some people in this room who went to his memorial service. And I talk to sometimes some kids from some pretty privileged backgrounds who may come from households where they come from, fairly right-wing politics. But I've really got them to sit down and listen when I talk to them about the fact that Masood had the legal right to be living in Britain. His sister is here legally as a refugee, but he had no means of getting here legally. He was stuck in Calais, a child, and he tried to smuggle himself into Britain in the back of a lorry, and he died in the back of that lorry. And that's what we've got to do, is really personalise this story, tragic as though it is and disturbing as it is, because it's when we talk about people, not swarms, not mobs, not all those kind of words, but people who are just trying to find a safe place to live, a safe place to build their lives, that we then can really take on the other side, really humanise this whole debate as part of the referendum. And I think, just very briefly, I haven't got much time, but sometimes, quite a lot of time, when I'm knocking on doors and I say to people, what are you concerned about? They'll answer immigration. And I say, what do you mean by that? And they'll say, oh, well, low wages, crowded schools and hospitals, my kids can't get a council house. And I want to and do acknowledge that those are all perfectly fair, reasonable and right concerns. But all those problems are not caused by immigration. They're caused by failed government policies. And just one final thought. I was with an event in Bristol with the German Green Party, with one of the co-leaders of the German Greens. And she told me a figure that I think is really inspiring and really exciting, really, that somewhere between 7 and 8% of German people have actually done something direct, physical, effective to help the refugees, the big influx that they had last year. They went to the bus station and took some warm bedding. They went down to a place where refugees had gathered and took some food. They took a spare tent. They maybe started and offered and gave some German lessons. That's getting on for 1 in 10 Germans have not just signed a petition, not just expressed their solidarity with refugees. They've actually physically gone and done something. Now, I believe that if we, as Britain, if we were to allow our fair share of refugees into Britain, I'm confident that at least 1 in 10 Britons, and maybe more than that, would actually directly go and take a step to help. There was a survey that said, it was published in The Independent, that showed how much that British people are among the warmest feelings, the warmest desire to help, the strongest desire to help refugees. The people are ready. It's only the government that's in the road. So one final thought to finish on. We've got the referendum. I believe we need to vote to remain in the referendum. And beyond that, I've got a saying, 2020 is too far away. What we have to do is get rid of this government long before 2020.